Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Arohana. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Mr. Amish Raj Mulmi, a renowned writer and geopolitical analyst from Nepal. Amish's insightful book, All Roads Lead North, has shed light on Nepal's complex relationship with China. Amish, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Swati, for having me. Pleasure.
Your work, the book, deeply dives into the geopolitical dynamics shaping South Asia. And I'm sure, the viewers are particularly interested in exploring the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative on Nepal. So, could you tell us more about this initiative, how that has reshaped Nepal's foreign policy and domestic politics?
Thanks, Swati. I think, see, to understand, let's say, what the BRI and China means for Nepal and South Asia, I think particularly for Nepal, we have to go back to 2015 when the India had serious issues over Nepal's new constitution and the border was sort of closed off. So at that time, particularly, China emerged as this political and economic alternative. And I think that is the key, right? That post 2012 or 2013, when Xi Jinping has come into power, China has presented itself as an alternative to countries in South Asia, as a political alternative, as an economic alternative to India in particular. And I think that is important to understand Nepal's perspective on the BRI as well, to where Nepal sees the BRI as an instrument that will allow it to fulfill its infrastructure gaps, to fulfill its development goals, and to expand trade and connectivity with China. Now, on the last part, trade and connectivity has obviously expanded since then. We are importing a lot more from China now, although our exports have been declining, primarily due to our own weaknesses. But in terms of infrastructure, there is a lot that has happened, but there is a lot that hasn't happened as well. So, for instance, we got two new airports. Both are not under the BRI, but China has been sort of like a little hazy on the definitions. And we have been sort of looking at how do we operationalize these airports. And I think that is a key question in front of us today. That first is obviously that we've taken a loan for one of the airports in Pokhara. What do we do with the airport if it's not operationalized? How do we pay back the loan? And the second question is, what exactly does the BRI entail in terms of its definition? Is it project-oriented? Is it a policy-specific measure? Is it sort of like, do we go by China's definition, or do we go by Nepal's definition that it's restricted to certain projects? So I think there is a bit of a quandary around the BRI at the moment, which is why I believe that one of the top agendas during the upcoming visit of our Prime Minister to China will be an BRI implementation agreement, within which I think Nepal will be insisting on cheaper loans. Nepal will be insisting on more grants. And Nepal will also be insisting on conversion of the existing Pokhara International Airport loan into a grant. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. But coming back to your question, what the BRI has done, not just for Nepal, I think, for the whole of South Asia, is that it has presented itself as a choice, as an alternative, and that allows small states such as Nepal in South Asia, to hedge their bets, against these, and especially at a time of this global contest, a global power contest that is happening in our backyard, all around us. I think it allows smaller states to hedge their bets against these greater powers. So in a way, it presents itself as that alternative that we did not have earlier.
Okay. You also mentioned that, there is an alternative power, for Nepal to fall into, and it's not just India. So when we see it from that view of geopolitical competition in the region, how does that influence India-Nepal ties?
I think we have to think of it from two perspectives, right? The first is that India-Nepal ties are very, very different than, let's say, a regular bilateral tie. We have an open border. Citizens of both countries work in each other countries, live in each other's countries, study. We have familial relations, cultural relations. So those are I mean, those are unique, right? I don't think there is any, and in terms of geography also, like let's say, I mean, the way Nepal is built, like in terms of geography, we are oriented towards India, which is the south, right? So I don't think that can be, let's say, like those mutually beneficial advantages that come with such a relationship. I don't think those can be overcome at all. Where I think the issue comes in, or rather, where I think there is a larger question of how does this geopolitics or how does the presence of China affect India-Nepal relations? Like I said, I think it is a question of choices. I think for smaller states, the more choices they have in terms of their global relations, in terms of their foreign relations, I think it's ideal for them. I think diversification is essential simply because, of course, dependence on one particular power is also not a very smart thing to do, especially in today's day and age. So I think where basically Nepal has succeeded is that it has taken care of both Chinese as well as Indian interests. I don't think that there is much, let's say, debate around that. So, of course, the question is how much, let's say, leeway can India, China, and increasing the US have vis-a-vis, let's say, each other's inside Nepal. And that is where I think Nepal's own diplomacy, Nepal's own negotiating capacity, and Nepal's primarily foreign policy foundations, these will become much more important. Well, if Nepal's, so for instance, Nepal currently maintains a non-alignment foreign policy wherein it doesn't want to join any security alliances. It is more than happy to conduct economic alliances or economic, let's say, diplomacy with other countries with all powers, But to do that, it has also not been very open to foreign investments. So to balance out these powers is obviously a difficult job. It's a difficult task. But like I said, I mean, small states require that choice, and they need to be smart enough to be able to navigate the tough choices that are coming in this geopolitical environment.
Okay, that's very interesting, and it really brings me to the question that Nepal is very strategically located, and amid the global power, that they have also shown interest in Nepal, uh, despite it being like a small country, but because of its geopolitical and strategic location. So amid all of that, how does Nepal leverage its own interest, to shape its diplomatic strategy while also safeguarding its sovereignty?
No, like I said, I think the foundation of non-alignment, I think that is extremely important for a small state like Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
What we need to do definitely is that we need to strengthen our diplomacy. We need to strengthen our diplomatic core. We need to strengthen our language of diplomacy as well as our negotiating capacities, right? Without doing that, I think increasingly it will become a non-alignment will become a tougher position because great powers are asking countries, smaller countries, to make choices. And that is the key, right? Like, I think Nepal has ensured that it has conveyed the message to other powers, other partners, that it is not interested in any security alliance. So it has rejected something called the State Partnership Program from the US, which is a partnership between the Nepal Army and the US National Guard. But it has at the same time accepted the Millennium Challenge Compact, which is a US grant to build transmission lines inside Nepal for export to India. So there are these choices that Nepal is making. Similarly, I think Nepal has rejected the Global Security Initiative, which is China's Xi Jinping's pet sort of like security umbrella, security policy measure that comes under his foreign policy thing. But it has at the same time accepted the GDI as well as the GCI and as well as the BRI. So you can see that Nepal's sort of like leaders, the way they're thinking is that, all right, anything to do with security, we don't want to be associated with that because we want to be equally friendly to all our partners. But when it comes to economy, when it comes to development, when it comes to bridging our infrastructure needs, I think there is an understanding that, all right, we have to take help or we have to take investments from wherever possible. Of course, at terms that are beneficial to us, which is, as I said earlier, the key agreement, the key understanding right now is that if we are to take more Chinese money, if we are to take more Chinese funds for infrastructure growth, then they need to be at concessional rates or they need to be grants. That is one of the key reasons why, let's say, other BRI projects haven't moved ahead. So
Mhm.
I think that's like I said, it's the key is you have to build up, you have to strengthen your own foreign policy, let's say, practice. Without doing that, the choices that are available to small states will not be available to us.
Okay. And like when we are talking about choices as well, of course, we can't ignore the persistent issue of border management, which is there, kind of a rift between India and Nepal. So, what recent developments or discussions particularly signal, progress in resolving those long-standing issues?
Uh, See, if you're talking about the border dispute, or rather the cartographic dispute, I don't think there's been any progress. I think it's become even more intractable. I think it has become protracted. India has not been willing to talk on the issue, and Nepal has sort of linked the issue inextricably to its sovereignty. So it has now reached a position where no Nepali leader can back down on the claim over Kalapani, right? So the sooner both countries resolve it, and it has to be done by a political dialogue. It cannot be done by, let's say, only at a secretary level, or it has to be done at a political level dialogue. The sooner both countries resolve it, the better it is. Otherwise, this is something that we have maintained since the beginning, since the time the border dispute flared up, that this has the potential to become a protracted issue between the two countries. And that is not good for the relationship at all. Mm.
Okay. And could you also throw some light on India's cultural diplomacy, how that has influenced Nepal? Any specific, initiatives that has proven, to be very significant to Nepal to
Well,
strengthen their bond?
yeah, I think what has happened is that post 2014, post the arrival of Narendra Modi, I think there has been a lot of emphasis on cultural national, on cultural ties beyond the usual roti beti narrative. And the way the Indian Prime Minister has done it is that he has himself visited two border towns of Janakpur and Lumbini. He's the first Indian Prime Minister to do that. And he has shown that beyond the symbolic significance of the cultural significance of these places. Lumbini, as you know, is the birthplace of Gautam Buddha. Janakpur is supposed to be the birthplace of Sita, and close connections with Ayodhya. So beyond those cultural symbolism, I think what Narendra Modi's visit to these two places in particular has done is it has increased Indian tourists to these places by a large number. And I think that has had economic knock-on effects. And that has really sort of like helped, let's say, local tourism. It has assisted in local tourism over there. Beyond that, the Prime Minister also visited this Himalayan temple called Muktinath, which is one of the world's highest temples. And over there also, I recently came back from that temple, and I can tell you that Indian tourists have started going to that temple in large numbers ever since Prime Minister Modi's visit. So those are let's say, the one serious effect that has happened is in terms of this cultural nationalism is that Indian tourists, Indian pilgrims have started coming to Nepal in large numbers. I think there is a greater understanding. There is a greater sort of like linkages around these, let's say, shrines, around these places, and this understanding that, all right, Nepal is part of this larger picture of, let's say, this cultural ties, right? But at the same time, I think we also have to not overemphasize, let's say, this cultural nationalism part. I think because what cultural linkages also do is that it engenders cultural nationalism, right? And we have seen that Nepali political leaders have sort of pushed back against India's sort of this cultural nationalism. For instance, our Prime Minister, he happily said that Ram was born in Nepal, not in Ayodhya, and then Kathmandu's mayor banned a Hindi film called Adi Purush because it said that Sita was not born in Nepal but was born in India. So there are these uh, pushbacks by local nationalists as well, right? Who do not, let's say, who see, let's say, India's claims on the cultural front, India's, let's say, expanding relations on the cultural front as a sort of, let's say, counter to their own local nationalism or local nationalistic tendencies, right? So it is So cultural nationalism, cultural diplomacy has its place. Cultural diplomacy is doing a great number of things. I think, like I said, Indian tourists are coming more and more. But of course, you also have to be a little cautious about how far can you take it. So I think, but on the whole, I would argue that, like I said, Indian tourists are coming to Nepal in more and more numbers, especially pilgrims. And that is, I would argue, the most visible impact of cultural diplomacy post 2014. So,
That was very insightful, like perspective to the dynamics of India-Nepal relations. We'd also like to, explore Nepal's role in terms of regional cooperation, because we see there's a minilateralism which is coming up, and in terms of India and Bangladesh. So, how do you see Nepal positioning itself within these emerging regional dynamics, specifically, when we talk about energy partnerships involving India and Bangladesh?
I think we are all excited about it. I think Kathmandu is quite excited about it. Kathmandu is very, very encouraged. Kathmandu, the potential, especially among this tripartite power agreement, that the potential that it brings, the opportunities that it brings, uh, especially among private power producers, it is quite a bit. Who are all looking forward. But right now, we also have to be, again, I'll have to tone that down, because the thing is that in India's power, actually, India has to sort of still ratify the agreement. So Nepal hasn't yet exported power to Bangladesh via India. So
Okay.
there is, I believe that this agreement is still being discussed in India. I think India is going to do it very soon. But once it does it, I think the potential is massive, right? We are only starting at 40 megawatts, which is literally a drop in the ocean. The potential of, let's say, beyond just looking at, I know that we have an agreement for 10,000 megawatts in 10 years, but I think if things go right, I think we will be exporting a lot more to India and as well as Bangladesh in the next 10 years. And I think it has given this mini, like you said, this minilateral, sort of like this tripartite agreement, it has given Nepal the confidence to even think about exporting power to Sri Lanka via India. So I think that's the thing, right? Like regional cooperation within South Asia, we've been talking about it since the 80s, since the 70s, right? And it's not something very new as an idea. What has changed is, I think that India is willing now to see the benefits, the mutual benefits that arise out of, let's say, this regional cooperation, this regional connectivity. And India has been doing a lot more post, let's say, like 2014 towards achieving this regional connectivity, wherein it's putting forth its own markets as sort of being accessible to Nepali companies, Nepali power exports, and as well as Bangladesh as well. So this, I would argue, is the larger, let's say, this is the greater development, that what we have now is a Delhi that is willing to see, that is willing to leverage its own markets, its own position, as this, let's say, sitting in the center of South Asia, and willing to sort of become the bridge between smaller states in South Asia. And I think that is the key here. And more, I think, like I said, in Nepal, there's a lot more excitement, there's a lot more enthusiasm about how this will translate. The quicker it happens, the better it is for all three, let's say, parties. Mhm.
Okay. So, just building on to what you just shared. So, can we expect a stronger South Asia in
Of
by
course,
by
of course.
2050?
Of course, I would not even take it that far. I would say, if, let's say, things are smoothened out, a lot of these, let's say, bilateral issues, like I said, you have these smaller issues that keep cropping up, right? You have the border, you have, let's say, like within India, Nepal, you have like the Agniveer issue, recruitment issue. You These small little things keep coming up, but what matters ultimately is that you can see the mutually beneficial sort of advantages that come from, let's say, this regional cooperation. And the more smaller states like Nepal, like Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, we can see that happening, right? And this is something that our leaders have been saying since the 80s. So the more this happens, better it is. I think definitely it is a very, very exciting time for South Asia. I think it's a very, very enthusiastic time for South Asia, simply because this power agreement, like I said, 40 megawatts is actually nothing, but it opens up the way for a much larger, much more, let's say, imaginative idea of cooperation, of regional cooperation. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, who knows? Maybe in another 10, 15 years, with the power capacities that we are developing, we may just export all the way to Sri Lanka by using Indian transmission lines. So it requires, like I said, like any sort of policy measure that comes in, it requires a bit of imagination, right? The more you sort of like be a little optimistic about it, I think there is the potential for regional cooperation in South Asia has never been greater. Mm.
Wow, so optimism is the key, and
Yes. Yes.
really, keeping at it.
Yeah.
Something
Yeah,
that is
it has, you have to. I mean, and this doesn't just require, of course, Delhi is the key player here, right? Because Delhi is, like I said, Delhi is at this sort of at the is pretty much the bridge in South Asia connecting all our countries. But our countries also, smaller countries also have to do their part. We also have to sort of keep pushing at it. We also have to convince, let's say, other countries that regional cooperation is the way ahead. And I think it's very interesting that we are having this conversation while the COP is happening, because that is another idea, right? We have to come together at these global forums. We have to come together as a global voice, as basically we represent about more than a sixth, a fifth of humanity lives in this region. So of course we need to come together on these platforms, on this, you have a common voice, right? And that comes from these small beginnings. The more you have, like, let's say, like, the more trust comes in, the more, let's say, countries start trusting each other, capitals start trusting each other. Of course, like I said, without being optimistic, what else can you do? But we have had a great beginning so far. We hope to see it being continuing. So
absolutely. And so, with that, we conclude our, questions. Thank you for really charting out all of them and, uh, really giving us very insightful, perspectives to the dynamics of India-Nepal relations in light of, Nepal's northern neighbor. And thank you, Amish. I'd really like to thank you for that. And so, as we conclude this discussion, it's really clear that India-Nepal relationship is multifaceted. It's layered, and which is constantly evolving. And as Amish, you mentioned, optimism is the key. So it's a relationship that has been shaped by history, culture, geopolitics, and of economic interests. So we really hope that our viewers, have taken valuable insights, from today's conversation that really delves into the current state of bilateral relationship and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Thank you for joining us, and thank you once again, Amish.
thank you so much, Swati.
We look forward to hosting you when you're in New Delhi.
Will be